What's the latest in the Israel-Hamas war? Qatar has withdrawn from negotiations in the hostage deal and is threatening to expel the Hamas leadership from the country. Fighting has continued in the Gaza Strip. The IPC is preparing to declare famine in northern Gaza just as the U.S. ultimatum to Israel, threatening a weapons embargo, is going to expire. Meanwhile, the IDF and Hezbollah continue escalations in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. I'm Alon Burstein. Let's dive deep into the latest of the Israel-Hamas war. On day 400 to the war, the biggest development relates to two reports regarding Qatar's role in the war and how this relates to the Hamas leadership. On Saturday, November 9th, it was reported in several different news outlets, both in Israel and throughout the Middle East, that Qatar has decided to expel the Hamas leadership from the country. As a reminder, after the death of Yahya Sinwar, Hamas is now led by a committee of 5 different leaders, all of which either permanently reside in Qatar or spend the majority of their time in the country. The reports were initially denied and treated as rumors. Hamas officially put out statements denying that such a request was made to the leadership. However, later in the day, Reuters and other news sites began to quote U.S. officials confirming that Qatar has accepted the request of the Biden administration to expel Hamas from the country due to the lack of progress in the hostage negotiations. Now, in a moment of analysis, I'll say that it is very likely that if Qatar has agreed to this move, it has less to do with U.S. pressure. This U.S. pressure to expel Hamas from the country has been constant in the last several months. It likely has more to do with the election result in the United States. It is very likely that Qatar, a close ally of the United States and a country that relies very heavily on U.S. protection of its interests in the Arab Gulf, is fearful both of the possible Trump reaction to being the country that hosts Hamas, and is also fearing the possibility that Trump would, quote unquote, authorize assassination of Hamas leaders in the country. Either way, Qatar itself has yet to confirm this report. Hamas, as I said, has denied that such a demand was made. However, it has been confirmed by the United States and by Israel and other actors in the Middle East. Very related to this, a second development that occurred on November 9th was that Qatar officially announced that the country is withdrawing from its position as mediator between Israel and Hamas in the war. In its announcement, the Qatari government stated that both Israel and Hamas have refused to show any good faith in the negotiations, and both have consistently only repeated their quote-unquote deal-breaker positions without attempting to advance in the talks. As a reminder, despite the attempts to restart the negotiations with a summit meeting a few weeks ago, there were no advances that were made between the sides. Israel is refusing to accept Hamas's demand that any deal will include an end to the war, while Hamas is refusing to accept Israel's demand for phased short-term deals without promising an end to the war and IDF withdrawal. I'll add here that while it has been reported repeatedly that Hamas never answered the latest proposals, in fact, the movement did give its answer to Qatar, but it did state that it would not discuss such proposals unless they include an end to the war and a complete IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. So where does this leave negotiations right now? It's important to remember several things. First, Qatar has already in the past threatened to both expel the Hamas leadership and withdraw from negotiations. This happened in April this year, and it led Hamas to explore the possibility of moving its headquarters either to Turkey or to Iran. Eventually, however, this was seen as a pressure mechanism to bring Hamas back to the negotiating table. It somewhat worked back then. Hamas came back to the table and actually agreed to the deal framework already in July. This time, it may be that this is the same type of pressure. If this is not the case, however, it will leave Egypt as the main regional negotiator between Israel and Hamas. In this regard, it's important to remember that there has been a recent reshuffle in the Egyptian government, and Hassan Rashad has replaced Abbas Kamel as the country's Minister of Intelligence. More importantly, that means that he is the new person in charge of these negotiations. While this was an internal Egyptian matter when that reshuffling took place, Rashad has far less experience when it comes to these regional scenes between Israel and Hamas, so it remains to be seen how he will attempt to lead the negotiations if, in fact, Qatar does withdraw and Egypt becomes a sole negotiator. Right now, no one really knows if this is just more a muscle flexing and a threat of Qatar, or if this is going to actually move forward. If it does move forward, Egypt will take that leading role, and we'll see where negotiations develop from that point. Meanwhile, alongside these developments, there have been important developments that occurred in the Gaza Strip and the Israel-Hamas front. Intensive fighting has been reported in Jabalia refugee camp and in Beit Lahia, both in the areas in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip surrounding Gaza City. At the same time, in Rafah, the IDF is also continuing to solidify its grip, and there's a lot of fighting that is reported in the outskirts of that city. Importantly, while the IDF has primarily reported that the operation in northern Gaza is centered in the areas of Jabalia refugee camp and Beit Lahia, the Al-Qassam brigades reported very intensive fighting in the Saja'ia region of northern Gaza on November 8th. This may indicate that the IDF is gradually expanding its operation in northern Gaza beyond those two areas into the other areas of Gaza City. Again, this was not reported by the IDF, but Al-Qassam brigades did report intensive fighting in the Saja'ia area. Meanwhile, amidst this ongoing fighting, the humanitarian situation in northern Gaza is continuing to worsen dramatically. As I stated in previous summaries, several things have contributed to this vast deterioration in the humanitarian situation in northern Gaza in the last 2 months. First, in mid-September, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered the IDF to initiate plans to take over the distribution of humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip. This happened despite the military's stern warnings against such a move. As part of this plan, and despite it not being implemented yet, the private organizations that have been employed to deliver aid in the Gaza Strip in coordination with the IDF have been gradually phased out after it was determined by Israel that they are involved in smuggling and in promoting black market activity. Meanwhile, alongside this, the expanding IDF operation in Jabalia refugee camp and the surrounding areas not only contributed to the deterioration of safe zones for food distribution, it also led to the closing of the Erez crossing, that is the main crossing that was delivering aid into the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. And this has come alongside continuous closures in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip after the IDF took over the Rafah crossing. In addition to all of these, the complete collapse of communication between the IDF and UNRWA in the Gaza Strip has also played a critical role in the deteriorating situation, all leading to substantial decrease in humanitarian aid getting to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip over the past 2 months. According to reports that were disseminated on November 9th, the IPC, which is the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, which is a reputable organization monitoring food security across the world, has prepared a report in which it shows that conditions in the Gaza Strip are nearing starvation and famine has developed in that region, leading to over 50,000 Palestinians being forced to evacuate to southern Gaza in the past month. Now, I will say that this development has led many diplomats and analysts to ask whether Israel is tacitly implementing what has become known as the quote-unquote general's plan in Israel. I'm not going to elaborate on that here, but I am mentioning it, and I will upload a special summary detailing the plan and whether it is being implemented in northern Gaza in the coming days. In addition to this obvious direct impact on the Palestinians in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, with regards to the larger impacts on the war, it's also important to note that the IPC report is scheduled to come out in the coming days, which is in very close proximity to the expiring of the ultimatum that the United States gave Israel regarding the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. As a reminder, on October 15th, the United States issued an unprecedented ultimatum to Israel, stating that weapons shipments to Israel may be canceled or withheld if the humanitarian situation in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip is not immediately alleviated. The administration cited legal restrictions within U.S. law prohibiting the transfer of weaponry to foreign countries where humanitarian law is not upheld. The ultimatum included the 30-day deadline for the humanitarian situation to improve, i.e., November 15th, Friday in this coming week. This is very close to when the IPC is scheduled to issue its report. According to some advanced news outlets, they have stated that report is going to state that starvation and famine is occurring in northern Gaza. As part of Israel's response to the U.S. ultimatum, not only has Israel tried to increase the amount of trucks that come in to the southern parts of the Gaza Strip that might make their way north, in addition to that, in the last several days, it has been reported that the IDF has been reconstructing the Kisufim crossing. This is another entry point into the Gaza Strip from Israel that was decommissioned after Israel evacuated from the Gaza Strip back in 2005. According to reports, Israel is attempting to rebuild this crossing in order to allow another entry point of humanitarian aid that will enter into the Gaza Strip, primarily as an attempt to demonstrate to the United States that Israel is taking the situation seriously. How the Biden administration will react to this, particularly now that it is quote-unquote freed from the election campaign considerations, remains to be seen. Again, that ultimatum does expire on this coming Friday. Meanwhile, on the Israel-Hezbollah front, Hezbollah has continued to fire between 100 and over 200 rockets and missiles each day towards northern Israel over the last several days, and there's also been an increase in the launching of drones over the past week. Substantial barrages were fired on November 6th, targeting central parts of Israel as well. On November 7th, large areas of northern Israel and the Carmel region were also targeted by different Hezbollah rockets. Meanwhile, the IDF has also continued to carry out scores of airstrikes throughout Lebanon, and as the military has also expanded its ground operations in southern Lebanon. Particularly large airstrikes were reported in the areas of Baalbek on November 7th, and an intelligence headquarters of Hezbollah was also targeted in the Lahia region of Beirut on that same day. Regarding negotiations between the sides, as a reminder, there were vast attempts to bring the sides to some sort of diplomatic resolution that will see an IDF withdrawal and the Lebanese army deploying in southern Lebanon and implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Despite a lot of reports in the last several weeks that there were advances made between the sides, on November 1st it was reported the negotiations between the two sides have broken down. In addition to Hezbollah's position, which has been vague and somewhat contradictory, to some extent saying it'll support whatever the Lebanese government says, on the other hand, imposing its own terms, the main point of disagreements between the Israeli and Lebanese governments relate to the mechanism of enforcing the deal. Israel has demanded that in addition to international guarantees and the Lebanese government's commitment that the Lebanese army will enforce the deal, the IDF will be granted the right to enforce weapons embargoes on Hezbollah and stop any attempts of Hezbollah to take up ground positions in southern Lebanon if the Lebanese military fails to do so. Lebanon has not agreed to this point and has insisted that only Lebanon or an agreed-upon international mechanism will be authorized to operate any force in southern Lebanon. Over the past several days, there have been reports that the United States, France, and other countries have been attempted to find a formula that will appease both sides, while also holding discussions with Hezbollah officials in an attempt to get all sides on board with this deal framework. At this point, however, there are no reports of major breakthroughs in the negotiations. It remains to be seen if the sides can come up with a formula that will be acceptable to all the parties that have to agree to this, particularly in light of the recent U.S. elections and the possible desire of different actors to stall a deal until the Trump administration takes office. Again, that relates to how different actors may read what will be Trump's position with regards to such a deal. One final report in addition to all this, a somewhat forgotten front, is the ongoing escalations between the Houthis in Yemen and Israel, but it is important to note that front is still ongoing. On November 7th, a missile was fired by the Houthis towards the eastern parts of Israel. It was intercepted before reaching its target near the Dead Sea. Those are my highlights from the last several days of the Israel-Hamas war. If you find these reports informative, please do remember to send them on to anyone you think might be interested in the war. Subscribe, turn on notifications if you want to know when reports come out. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a visiting assistant professor and an Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.